Today we're going to be talking about something that is pretty relevant to, I would say, just about all of us. You know, stress is something that is so pervasive in our culture. It's something we deal with on a daily basis, but I have a feeling that most of us don't even really know exactly what stress is. You know, we kind of know maybe what it feels like, we know the symptoms of stress, but what exactly is stress? So that's what we're going to be talking about. And I actually kind of find it funny. We labeled this lecture, you know, Conquer Stress. And when I sat down to write this, you know, I was thinking, you know, that's such an American thing to say. You know, we're going to conquer stress. You know, we're going to beat our adrenal glands into submission, and they're going to pump out the hormones that we want. And in reality, that's not exactly what we're going to be talking about, and not really what we want to accomplish. What we really want to be looking at is identifying what are triggers of stress in our life, and then how do we adapt to it. Because, you know, stress is something, whether we like it or not, whether we're on a beach, whether we're here in Wichita, Kansas, we're going to have to deal with on some level. And so what we want to do is to be able to identify certain patterns that we have that might trigger a stress response. What does a stress response look like? And then what can we do to change those patterns? So that's what we're going to be talking about. More about adapting to stress, and then renewing our adrenal glands. So with stress, you know, the best analogy I could come up with is, you know, stress for each of us is like a cup of water. You know, we each have, you know, a different size cup. You know, some people have a bucket and they can handle a lot of stress before they feel the effects. Some of us have a really small glass. And so each time we put stress on our body, it's like putting a drop of water in that bucket. And some of those stressors we can identify, you know, whether it's our job, whether it's our husband, whether it's, you know, something in our environment. You know, some of these stressors we're pretty aware of. But some of the stressors, I have a feeling we don't realize that we're putting drops in our bucket. And so that's gradually filling up each of our capacity to be able to deal with stress on a daily basis. And so for everything that we can control, all of the stressors that are in our diet, the stressors that are, you know, in the water that we drink, you know, in our environment, whether it's pollutants, whatever we can control, we want to work on eliminating. And so Megan had actually mentioned the Food as Medicine course, and that's a course that we just started a few weeks ago here at the Reardon Clinic, and it's a 2-hour course all about food stressors. So if you're interested, you know, in a little bit more detail, you know, in some of the food that might be causing stress on your body, I would highly, highly recommend that you grab a friend and come to that course, because you'll get a lot more in-depth information than we have time to cover today. So what we want to do, like I said, is look at what's filling up our glass and how do we reduce those stressors. So I love this quote: "The art of living lies in a fine mingling of letting go and holding on." So we'll address this over and over again, you know, being able to identify patterns of stress and identify things that might be causing us stress that we aren't aware of. So what is stress? Does anybody have any ideas? What is, when I say the word stress, what comes to your guys' minds when I say that? Any thoughts? Go ahead and shout it out. Adrenaline, anxiety. Any other thoughts? Nobody said their husband? That's what I was saying. No, I'm kidding. You know, and so, you know, we really don't, you know, fully understand what is stress. You know, is it a feeling? Is it an emotion? Is it a state of mind? You know, I think this picture pretty, you know, accurately describes what we feel when we're under stress, but it's really hard to kind of define what exactly is it. So I'm going to quote the famous philosopher Brody Zotterer, my 3-year-old son, and rephrase the question and ask, why? Why do we have stress? Because really, why does stress exist is a better question to be asking, because this will explain how that stress is triggered and why we're having some of those feelings associated with it. So this is why stress exists. Oh, I'm sorry. No, first of all, outline. These are just some of the things. We're going to first look at a biological perspective. We're going to look at why stress exists. We're going to look at triggers of stress, and then we're going to look at how we can support the body and support the adrenal glands. So this is why stress exists. Woo, that wasn't in your notes, was it? So from when you look at an evolutionary perspective, this is why stress exists. Our stress response evolved and formed in our bodies to be able to help us deal with something like this. That when we encountered a situation where we had an immediate threat, our body had to be able to deal with it. So it became very advantageous for us to be able to have, mobilize energy and have a response within the body that helped us deal with this type of stressor. So why stress exists at a very basic biological level is to help us mobilize energy quickly when our body needs it most. So star this page, circle it. We're going to go back to this quite a bit, but really what stress is helping us do is very quickly mobilize energy. So all the responses, all of the hormones we're going to talk about go back to this idea, because the human that could mobilize energy the fastest was the one that could run away from the bear the fastest, or the one that could fight the bear the hardest. So those that survived were able to, bring about this stress response much faster than maybe their peers. So in the body, this is what stress looks like. At a very kind of basic level, this is what stress looks like. So when we start off, we have this trigger here. So we have this bear. And for the human that encounters this sort of situation, you have some sort of a sensory perception of this bear. So maybe you see the bear, maybe you hear the bear, maybe you hear something that you think is a bear. So you have some sort of sensory input in the brain that the brain triggers, aha, this is a stressor. I need to react, and I need to react very quickly. So what happens in the brain is the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary gland to release a hormone called ACTH. So adrenocorticotropin hormone gets released from the pituitary, very quickly travels down and stimulates the adrenal glands. So our adrenal glands are just two little tiny glands that sit on top of our kidneys. So they're just very small glands that have a big responsibility in the body. So this ACTH is stimulating the adrenal glands to release hormones that we need for immediate energy. So the three most common that we all probably recognize are adrenaline, which is our very immediate stress response hormone, noradrenaline, and cortisol. So all three of these hormones help the body mobilize energy very quickly. Now, one thing I'll point out about this diagram that's a really important thing to note, and if any of you have actually read the Health Hunter article that I wrote, I actually introduced the article with this idea, but we are actually primed for stress. So in the Health Hunter article, I described this scene where a person was out for a hike and they took a break, and while they're resting, they hear a twig snap behind them. So before they even know what caused that twig to snap, they don't know if it's a rock falling, if it's the wind blowing, or if it's a bear, but before they even can perceive what the stressor is, their body is already primed for stress. So it's very advantageous to have that quick stress response. So our brain, the way our brain is hardwired is that we need to quickly respond to stress. So if something is even perceived as a possible threat, our body is going to respond. And so, that becomes very relevant for us in our lives, because there are a lot of stressors that we might perceive as a stressor, and our brain is primed to respond to as a stressor, but may or may not, in fact, actually be a stress that our body needs to mobilize energy for. So that becomes an important point, an actual stressor versus a perceived stressor. So, some of these, these pathways we have in our brain are actually biologically hardwired. Like, you don't really have to teach a 3-year-old to be afraid of a bear. If they ran into this in the wild, they would know to run away. So that's why there's certain species, certain animals like spiders and snakes that we have a greater propensity to be scared of versus bunnies. Bunnies have never been a threat to us, and so biologically, it's never been hardwired that we need to be scared of bunnies. So a lot of this, our brain is actually primed for stress, and it's primed and just waiting for us to develop these stress responses. Now, I will say, this is kind of a side note, kind of a funny side note. How many people are familiar with a selfie? You guys know what a selfie is? Most people on social media, you take a picture of yourself, you post it on social media. So, you know, I actually heard a story a couple of weeks ago on NPR that the U.S. Forest Service actually had to issue a warning against people taking selfies with bears. So if you look at this guy and you look at, there's the bear in the background, this apparently is a really common thing. So, you know, this guy's biology is not, you know, at work here. You know, he might have these ingrained stress responses, but he's overriding it. And so it's kind of a funny example, but it proves the point that if we want to override our stress response, we can. You know, we have that power, we have that ability. So, but don't be that guy. Don't be that guy that's taking a selfie with a bear. So this is an important slide to really kind of clarify what we're about to get into, because we're about ready to kind of dive into some anatomy and dive into some physiology that can get a little bit heavy, but it's critically important to understand kind of the big picture of stress. So when we experience stress, especially if we experience chronic stress, what happens is initially we have a high adrenal output. So a lot of these hormones, our cortisol levels, our aldosterone levels, you know, our adrenaline levels, all of these hormones initially are very high. And so that picture of stress looks very different than when we get into this phase right here, where we actually have adrenal fatigue. So this is the point where our adrenal glands get to where they stop responding to that ACTH and they lose the ability to be able to pump out some of these adrenal hormones. So I'm going to, you know, as we describe these hormones, I'm going to be constantly going back and forth between these two states, you know, between a high adrenal output and then a chronic adrenal fatigue state. Yeah?
Would your cortisol level be low if you were in adrenal fatigue?
Yes. Exactly. So cortisol, so initially when we're under stress, and we'll go over this a little bit more, but initially when we're under stress, you know, and we have a high adrenal output, we're going to have, for most of them, an increase in our hormones, so a higher cortisol state. But over time, the more and more the body relies on, you know, that cortisol being pumped out, eventually the adrenal glands just fatigue out and they get into the state where they just can't muster up an adrenal response. And that's when we get into adrenal fatigue. And actually for a lot of us, you know, we go back and forth between these two states. You know, we might be in a state of adrenal fatigue, we do the right supplements, maybe we go on vacation, we take a rest, we treat ourselves well, and then, you know, we kind of get, but we don't ever address the root cause. We don't ever address why we were stressed to begin with. And if we don't address that, we're just kind of flipping ourselves back into this high adrenal output state, and this cycle just continues. So what we want to do is break the cycle, identify where the stress is coming from, and then we can, you know, stop this cycle from continuing. So when we look at stress hormones, you know, this is kind of an immediate stress response. So this is the profile of what somebody who is running from a bear looks like. You know, this is kind of that acute adrenal response. And these are some of the physiological responses that we have. And if you want to kind of picture what this looks like in yourself, you know, just imagine that you've been asked to give a talk in front of 10,000 people, but you haven't been told what you're going to talk about. That's a high adrenal, acute adrenal state. So in this sort of state, you know, breathing becomes faster and more shallow. Our pupils dilate to be able to let in more light. You know, if we were running from a bear, we have to be able to take in the horizon. So more light is coming in the pupils. The heart rate increases. It has to be able to pump blood faster because we're going to be running or we're going to be fighting a bear. Blood pressure increases. Some blood vessels will dilate. Others will constrict. So all the blood vessels that send blood to your digestive system are going to constrict. This is why if anybody's ever, you know, exercised with a high intensity, you know, for an extended period of time, even if you're exercising in 100-degree weather, if you feel your stomach afterwards, it's going to be cool because all that blood has been shunted away and it's being shunted to your vital organs and shunted to your muscles to be able to, you know, burn this energy. Digestive secretions shut down. Again, if we're running from a bear, we're not really worried about digesting our lunch. You know, we're more concerned about not becoming lunch, you know, for the bear. Sweating increases. Again, you're going to be burning a lot of energy. You're going to be heating up. Muscle tension increases. I see this a lot. How many of us have, just chronically tight muscles? That's, a really classic sign of high adrenal output all the time. And then our cortisol starts converting our stored energy, which is called glycogen, into a usable form. So all of this, when we look at it in the context of an acute stress response, we can understand why all of this is so important. But you can start to see the picture where if we live in this state and we're chronically stressed, why so many people have digestive issues. We're not fully digesting our food because our digestive system isn't working at 100%. This is why, blood pressure medications are, so rampant and so many people have high blood pressure. This is why we have chronically tight muscles. It's all related to a stress response. So let's dive in. I told you we'd get into some anatomy and physiology, and I'll try and keep this somewhat simplified. But this is what it looks like if we were to take one of our adrenal glands and kind of cut it through the middle. Our adrenal gland actually has different layers associated with it. And the reason I point out these layers is each of the layers is responsible for producing certain hormones. And each of the layers respond to that ACTH, the hormone that's released from the pituitary. Each of these layers respond to that in a little bit of a different way. So it becomes important when we have this conversation about adrenal hormones. So this is a list, and we'll go into more detail with each of these, but this is a list of each of the different adrenal hormones and which layer they're secreted by. So a lot of these you actually would recognize. You recognize cortisol, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, adrenaline. One that you might not recognize is one called aldosterone. But all of these are hormones secreted by the adrenal glands. And I think probably the most surprising on this list, a lot of people are surprised to find that a lot of our sex hormones are in fact actually produced by the adrenal glands. When you're in your 20s and 30s, it's primarily your reproductive organs. In women, it's the ovaries that produce the majority amount of estrogen, but it's the adrenal glands that produce most of the testosterone. But after you go through menopause and your ovaries kind of shut down for business, a lot of that responsibility gets shifted to the adrenal glands to produce these hormones. So if you burn your adrenals in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, by the time you get to your 50s and 60s, a lot of us are requiring bioidentical hormones because the adrenal glands just cannot muster up the response to produce those hormones. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you get your hormone levels back and they're low. It might not necessarily be a problem, with your reproductive hormones. It might be more of an adrenal issue. So let's talk about these. So aldosterone, I wanted to start with this one because this one, like I said, is one that's probably not real familiar for a lot of people, but it's a incredibly important hormone. So what aldosterone does, it's released from the zonula glomerulosa, and aldosterone is responsible for maintaining fluid concentration. So if we, need, more fluid, it's going to hold on to more sodium. If we need to get rid of excess fluid, it's going to, release more sodium because the water is going to follow where the sodium goes. So for instance, somebody who's in a high adrenal output state where you're releasing a lot of aldosterone, that's going to be somebody who's going to have that puffy look because high aldosterone means high sodium and high fluid retention. So you're going to get that kind of puffy face, maybe puffy ankles, kind of bloated feeling. That's a high aldosterone output. Now you look to the flip side of that to somebody who is in a low adrenal state and low aldosterone. That's going to be the person who has released a lot of their sodium. They might be craving salt. They might be really thirsty all the time, maybe frequently having to go to the bathroom and urinating. And they're just lethargic. They don't have, all of those electrolytes we have that maintain, the electric gradient around our cells. That's what facilitates transport in and out of our cells. And so if those electrolytes are missing and that transport doesn't happen, you're going to feel really lethargic. You're going to feel really fatigued. You're going to feel like you got hit by a bus. So aldosterone is extremely important in relation to how we feel energy-wise. So aldosterone, what's interesting about kind of the patterns of aldosterone is it follows the same secretion patterns as cortisol, because it's ACTH that stimulates the release of aldosterone, and it's also ACTH that stimulates the release of cortisol. So what we'll see is kind of like with cortisol, it's going to peak between 8 a.m. and then it's going to bottom out between midnight and 4 a.m. So it's going to follow kind of the same patterns as cholesterol. And like I said, it responds to the stimulation by ACTH. Now, where it's a little bit different than cortisol is cortisol has a feedback mechanism in the brain. So theoretically, if your cortisol levels get too high, there's a negative feedback loop in the brain, and the brain will shut down production of ACTH. Not so with aldosterone. Aldosterone does not have a negative feedback loop. So if your aldosterone levels get too high, the only response the body has is to desensitize the cells of the zonula glomerulosa to the aldosterone. So those cells become less and less sensitive. And where this is important is that doesn't happen very quickly. You know, it's going to take 24 hours of kind of those peak ACTH levels for the zonula glomerulosa cells to say, you know what, I can't put out anymore, I'm done, we're shut down. So they're going to slowly decrease their, sensitivity to the ACTH. So, with the aldosterone, you're not going to see quick fluctuations in this hormone like you would maybe some of the other adrenal hormones. So this is just a little, my depiction, not very good, but this is my depiction of what it looks like as far as ions. You have, higher concentration of sodium outside the cell, higher concentration of potassium inside the cell. So too much aldosterone, you're going to have fluid retention outside the cell, but as you decrease, you go into an adrenal fatigue and you decrease aldosterone, you're going to see this sodium disappearing, and with it goes the water. And so then slowly you're going to see the potassium leave the cell in the water outside the fluid outside the cell. So this is kind of a more, you can think of it like a dehydrated cell, when you're in a real low adrenal output state. So this is what, low aldosterone looks like. You've got, like I mentioned, the craving for salt and increased thirst. You're going to have muscle weakness. You're just going to feel lethargic. You might have an irregular heartbeat. The force of your heart contractions might decrease, and you might have lightheadedness when you stand up too quickly. So if you were sitting down or you were laying down and you all of a sudden sit up and you start to see black spots, that's classic adrenal fatigue. Now, it could be a few other things, but if you've got the rest of this symptom profile, that is very often associated with a low adrenal output. Cortisol, okay, cortisol is kind of the Mac Daddy of our adrenal hormones, and it's what we all hear about, what we all think about when we talk about, our adrenal glands. And so cortisol, has a huge responsibility. Cortisol's job is to maintain proper balance of blood sugar. So it needs to maintain that we have a steady state of energy available for all of the cells in our body. So if our blood sugar starts to go down, cortisol will go up. It'll pull the energy stored as fat, stored as glycogen, and start converting it into a form that the body can use. So if cortisol levels are too low and that energy is needed and you need to muster that energy, you think it's going to happen very efficiently? No. So this is going to contribute to that low energy, that fatigue feeling that we get with adrenal fatigue. So anytime, and I bolded this, star this, highlight this, because this is what ties into the diet. But anytime you have a drop in blood sugar, that's going to cause the adrenal glands to have to make and release more cortisol. So where does this become significant for us and in our American diet? Here it is. So now we have this exact same adrenal axis picture, but look at this. Now, instead of it being the bear that's the trigger, that's triggering this stress response, now it's the sugar. Because every time you have one of these sugars, like maybe in the form of a soda, candy bar, bread has got a really high sugar content, and wheat has a very high starch content. So it's going to stimulate the same response as having a candy bar. But this is what happens to your blood sugar. you kind of go on this roller coaster ride where all of this sugar is dumped into your bloodstream. And so the body has to release a lot of insulin, and it has to take all that sugar and try and use it very quickly so that it doesn't have a toxic effect on the body. And so it uses it very quickly, but then look what happens. It's like you eat that candy bar, and a half an hour afterwards, all of your whole all of your cells are have enough sugar, and you have all this insulin floating in your system. So it's just like you're raising your arms up, like going over the peak and like flying down this roller coaster, and your blood sugar just tanks. And so you go into what's known as a hypoglycemic response. So we've all had this. You have a piece of cake, and an hour and a half later, you're hungry again, or you start to get a little bit shaky, or you get lightheaded. That's that hypoglycemic response where our blood sugar goes too low. This right here is where the body starts sensing, wait a second, I don't have enough sugar, I don't have enough energy. So it taps on the adrenal glands and says, hey, listen, we need some cortisol. We need to mobilize energy. So even though, it's related to something you're eating and it's not related to a bear, you're still having the same stress response. You're still releasing cortisol, and your body's still responding in the same way. We might not perceive it as a stress in that way, but it's the same drops of bucket that you're throwing into your bucket that's causing it to fill up more and more. So this is one, huge hidden source of adrenal fatigue is what we're eating. And for some people, it may be their only source, of stress. Maybe their life is great. They don't have external stress, but what they're eating is putting a lot of stress on their system. So some of the other effects of cortisol, this is why cortisol is so important, because it doesn't just regulate our blood sugar. It also has an anti-inflammatory response. So if your cortisol levels are too low, if you are in an adrenal fatigue state and your body isn't producing enough cortisol, then you're going to set the stage for an inflammatory disease. Inflammation is going to increase in the body. And so it's going to, just kind of set the stage for you to be sick more often. It's going to set the stage for inflammatory conditions such as fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue, all of the inflammatory related conditions, any itis. Really, any itis condition, could be related to your cortisol levels being too low. Cortisol also helps regulate our white blood cells. That's why, people, sometimes you hear that when you're under stress, your immune system is actually boosted, but sometimes you hear when you're under stress, your immune system is suppressed. So what is it? How does that work? So cortisol is that connection. Cortisol is the connection to our immune system. So cortisol almost has the responsibility of keeping our white blood cells in check. We need our white blood cells there, when we have an infection to go in and destroy it. But if left unchecked, those cells could start destroying our own tissue. So cortisol's responsibility is to regulate those white blood cells. So if you're in a high adrenal output, cortisol's really high, you're going to have a suppressatory effect on the immune system, and your white blood cells are going to go down. Now, if you look at this from the opposite perspective, and maybe you're in an adrenal fatigue state, cortisol levels are too low, now you've lost that check on the immune system and that check on your white blood cells, and you kind of set the stage possibly for an autoimmune condition to develop, where your white blood cells actually start attacking yourself. So there's kind of a dual effect there of the cortisol, depending on if your levels are too high or too low. Ideally, you want a good balance so that when it's needed, the cortisol can suppress the white blood cells, but when it's not, they can let the white blood cells do their job. Cortisol also has a big impact on the cardiovascular system. So it can control constriction of certain blood vessels. So this plays into, the high blood pressure that a lot of people in our society have. And probably one of the most significant but yet kind of understated effects that cortisol has is high cortisol levels affect the brain. And some of the biggest ways that people see this are with memory changes, changes in mood. If you've kind of traditionally had a pretty long fuse, and then all of a sudden little things just irritate you, little things that maybe you were able to handle before now just really get on your nerves. That's cortisol, and that's cortisol's effect on the brain. And it can affect sleep. You know, anybody who has a sleep disorder most likely also has a cortisol disorder. And you see this, you see changes in sleep with both high cortisol and low cortisol. You know, so your high cortisol people are going to be those that, you know, especially if the cortisol levels are high in the evening, those are going to be your people that have a hard time falling asleep, that they'll lay in bed for 2 or 3 hours and not fall asleep. But then, you know, or you could have the opposite where your cortisol levels are too high when you wake up. These are the people that feel like they got hit by a bus when they woke up because their body was busy all night long mobilizing energy and they didn't get the rest that they needed. Now, low cortisol levels, those tend to be your people that wake up at 2 a.m. every morning. They wake up at 2 a.m., they're up from 2 to 4, they can't go back to sleep. You know, maybe they wake up and they're hungry. Those are your low cortisol people because, you know, even though cortisol decreases at night, it doesn't completely go away. And it's needed, you know, because when we, you know, maybe have our last meal at 8 o'clock at night and then we don't eat until 8 o'clock the next morning, we're in a fasting state. And so, again, cortisol's main job is to mobilize energy when the body needs it. So during that fasting period, when we don't have glucose readily available, cortisol has to mobilize energy. And if you're in a low cortisol, low adrenal state, and that cortisol isn't being released in the middle of the night, the body has a backup plan because the brain isn't going to starve. It's not going to go without energy for very long without waking you up. So what the body does in place of releasing the cortisol is it might release a little bit of adrenaline. And adrenaline can have that same effect as far as mobilizing energy, but it's also going to wake you up. And so, especially if you're that type of person that wakes up in the middle of the night with your heart racing and your heart pounding and you kind of wake up suddenly, that's, you know, that low cortisol, kind of high, you know, adrenaline output state. For a lot of people, if this is you, you know, re-regulating your cortisol patterns can do, you know, wonders for helping you sleep at night. Although easier said than done. Okay, don't be overwhelmed by this. I've actually found it with teaching this food course, I've actually found that kind of diving into the biochemistry a little bit really helps people understand the complexity of our body, but also the intelligence and the beauty of our body. So this is, you know, actually, believe it or not, this is actually a simplified drawing of our adrenal cascade and how these hormones are made. So if you look at the very top, cholesterol, look at this, cholesterol is actually the precursor to all of these hormones. So that cardiologist that's telling you get your cholesterol as low as you possibly can, the lower the better, I would have to question his judgment because you're taking away this precursor to all of your stress hormones. And so, again, you don't want cholesterol too high, but a cholesterol below 150 is not good. I've been in that state, and it's a very poor state to be in, and you feel that low adrenal, that fatigue type of state. So if your cholesterol is actually below 150, start eating some eggs, start getting that cholesterol level back up again. So cholesterol gets turned into pregnenolone, which maybe some of us have heard about, and then it's from pregnenolone that we start seeing conversion to all of these other hormones we've been talking about. So pregnenolone gets converted into our aldosterone. See, this is our aldosterone that we talked about. This is our cortisol that we just talked about. The cortisol is made in the zona fasciculata. And then way over on the other side here, we have our reproductive hormones. So we have our DHEA, which gets converted into our testosterone and our estradiol. And so the significance of this graph is if you think about it from an immediate stressor state. Like if I'm in an acutely stressed state, which do you think my body's going to need to produce more of? Cortisol or estradiol? Cortisol. Cortisol is going to win out every single time. And in fact, the zona reticularis, which produces a lot of these sex hormones, is very similar to our aldosterone, to where it's very easily inhibited. And if we're in a high stress state, that's going to be inhibited, and our body's not going to be producing a lot of our sex hormones. You know, we don't need to be procreating if we're running from a bear. So again, this all makes sense from, you know, a biochemistry and a biological perspective, but you can start to see where things go wrong. You know, if we are overfeeding and over demanding this pathway, we're never going to get over here, and we're never going to have enough of those hormones. So as in terms of, adrenal-wise, our sex hormones do play an important part with the adrenal glands. They actually balance the effects of cortisol. So they help kind of keep cortisol in check. Our body is, all of our biochemistry is, the purpose of it is to keep everything in check and keep everything balanced. So we have a lot of checks and balances so that nothing gets too far out of control. These hormones also have an important, I think I just died. They also have an important anti-aging effect on the body as well. For women, if you're in a high adrenal state, you're probably going to be experiencing more PMS symptoms. If you're in a low adrenal state, you're going to be probably experiencing changes in libido. So all of these, again, if our body is perceiving stress and threat, we don't need to focus our time and energy on some of these other things. So like I mentioned, the zona reticularis becomes less responsive as stress increases. Whew, okay, puppies and babies. That was a lot of stuff. So let's take a brain break for a second. I mean, it's like you can't get anything cuter than a baby kissing a puppy, right? So that was a lot of biochemistry, a lot of that, kind of, I want to let some of that sink in, and what we're getting ready to kind of transition into is starting to understand some of the triggers. What is triggering this release of cortisol? Beyond some of the things we can identify, what is triggering the release of these hormones? So identifying our triggers of stress. So what is the trigger? This is the $1,000,000 question. What is it that's triggering this response in the body? So as far as external triggers, and actually before I go into this, one thing I would encourage everybody to do, tonight or this weekend, go home and maybe make a list of stress triggers that you know of in your life. Maybe it's certain eating habits that you have. Maybe it's certain relationships that you have. Maybe it's a certain environment that you're in. But it's a helpful exercise to kind of meditate and think through what is causing the stress response on a daily basis for me. And sometimes even just thinking through that and kind of understanding now what some of these symptoms look like, it might help you identify certain triggers that you didn't know existed. So some of the external triggers that I would suggest you look at are, people in relationships. There are toxic relationships, and it's not even current relationships that you're in, but maybe it's past relationships that you've been in the past, that maybe it was a parent relationship that had a significant impact on you, and you learned to deal with stress in the wrong way because that's the way your mom dealt with it. So explore these relationships and explore what sort of impact they've had on you, because they've impacted all of us, and that's really what kind of determines how we perceive the world and how we deal with stress, our relationships. Look at certain environments that you're in. If you're in certain environments that can trigger stress, identify that and maybe change those environments. Finances, and some of this stuff, it seems like we might not have control over, but maybe we control how we approach a certain thing. So with finances, maybe we reevaluate what we need to spend our money on and what's important to us, and take out what the world is telling us and really look inside at what do we need to survive. Look at your occupation. Occupation is a huge stress for a lot of people. Am I doing a job that I don't enjoy because I'm making money to buy things that I think that I need? All of that is just triggering that whole stress cascade. Look at certain situations. What's funny about this is my husband and I moved to Wichita about 2 years ago, and one of the biggest reasons was we lived in Atlanta, and for me to get to my job and him to get to his job, we were driving over an hour and a half each way. I mean, talk about stress. I mean, it was too much. And so, I don't think you're ever going to get us to leave Wichita, where it's 10 minutes to get anywhere. But certain situations like traffic, or if your job is presenting, giving a speech, and that's constantly triggering a stress response, evaluate those situations that you're in. Sensory information. The world that we live in is sensory overload. We constantly have a computer attached to our hip. We're constantly looking at videos, constantly looking at how everybody else is living, what everybody else is buying, what everybody else is doing. And, all of that sensory input can, trigger a stress response. You know, if we think that we're not living up to whatever standard social media has ascribed, that's causing a stress response. Kind of as a side note to this, you know, one of the hormones we didn't really talk about because it's not necessarily directly associated with the adrenal glands is melatonin. Melatonin is kind of the, you know, antithesis to cortisol, where cortisol levels are going down, melatonin goes up, and that's what makes you sleepy at night. Well, melatonin is triggered in the brain by darkness. So if we constantly have this artificial source of light, you know, we're never going to be able to get our melatonin levels up high enough to be able to go to sleep, which is why a lot of people have sleep disorders. And for some people, I've actually had people where regulating your melatonin levels will actually help regulate your cortisol levels. So, you know, so all of this is kind of a dance and a symphony between a lot of different things. So as far as like external triggers of stress, identify certain, you know, sensory triggers, whether it's certain things that you're seeing, certain lights, certain environments, or even certain things that you're hearing. Is it the music that you're listening to? Is it the podcasts that you're listening to? You know, are these things conjuring up certain feelings of, you know, possibly even a stress response that could be contributing, you know, again, drops of water in our bucket that are filling up our bucket. Oh, chronic pain. Ooh, this is a big one. Chronic pain is a huge source of stress. And so, you know, I know it's not always within people's control. Nobody wants to be in pain, but identifying that that could be one of your sources of stress is important. So this next slide I called tangible external triggers, because these are certain things, and this is one list to really, really take a close look at, because these are things that we do have control over. And these are things that this food as medicine course, we're going to go into in a much, much greater detail. So if this slide interests you, sign up for the course. But certain tangible external triggers are sugar. We mentioned sugar and the effects that that has on your blood sugar. But even the chemicals we're exposed to. You know, the chemicals we're exposed to in the water that we drink, in the air that we breathe, in the furniture that we sit on, you know, all of that contributes to those drops in our bucket. Preservatives in food, you know, buying, you know, non-organic food, you know, that has the pesticide residue on it, all of that, you know, contributes to the stress response in the body. There are certain things, you know, alcohol and tobacco that, again, can cause a stress response in the body, cause the release of cortisol. Chronic prescription or over-the-counter medication use. You know, I think we live in a world where it's so easy to pop a pill, but we don't really understand the effects that that pill has on our body and how difficult it is for our liver to detoxify that medication, and, you know, what effects on our biochemistry those medications have. You know, remember that picture I had up of our hormone cascade? Well, the whole purpose of medications is, you know, most of them work by inhibiting certain enzymes. So their whole goal is to shut down those certain biochemical pathways. Well, you can't shut down one without having an effect on others. So kind of, you know, unintentionally that can cause stress in the body. Lack of sunshine, fresh air, you know, that kind of, you know, again, seems like a no-brainer, but I mean, how many hours a day do we spend inside breathing recycled air and, you know, not getting enough sunlight? You know, just check all of our vitamin D levels, and I would say that probably speaks pretty highly to that. Caffeine, you know, I'm not an anti-caffeine person. I love my coffee, but if you're in a high adrenal state, caffeine is just going to push that up higher and higher. So if you're in a high adrenal state or even adrenal fatigue, cut out the caffeine, because it's just being, you know, acting as a crutch for you. And then lack of sleep. You know, the sleep thing goes both ways. You know, your cortisol levels can affect your sleep patterns, but your sleep patterns can also affect, you know, the regulation of your cortisol. So if you're staying up late, you know, waking up early, not getting enough sleep, that's going to affect cortisol levels not only at night, but also throughout the day. Emotional triggers. You know, this isn't one I'm going to go into too heavy, but I just wanted to have this available to think about, that, you know, there are certain, you know, emotional triggers that each of us have that trigger a stress response whether we realize it or not. And the only one I'm going to kind of touch on a little bit is, you know, negative thought patterns. You know, a lot of us, you know, well, let me give you a story. So the way you can think about connections in the brain and the way, you know, we have certain thoughts, you can think of it, you know, that as that connection almost like you're riding a bicycle in the sand. You know, the first time you forge a new neural connection in the brain, like when your you know, son or daughter or your grandson or granddaughter first learned to walk, it was incredibly difficult because they had to make new connections in the brain. So it's like riding a bike in the sand for the first time. It's incredibly difficult and you have to use a lot of energy, but as soon as you have that path, the more you ride it, the easier and easier it gets to ride it. Well, the easier and easier it gets to ride it, the harder and harder it gets to get off of it. And that's what a lot of our thought patterns look like, is we've ridden along these patterns of thinking so many times, and it's just so ingrained in us, we don't even realize that we're doing it. And even if we do recognize it, it's very difficult to get off of it. And so, you know, I strongly encourage a lot of meditation. You know, just thinking about something is forming new neural connections. So meditating on certain things, meditating on positive thoughts, meditating on the type of person you want to be and the way you want to perceive the world is extremely important. So, but a few other emotional triggers that a lot of people, you know, deal with are lack of purpose. You know, whether that's occupationally, whether that's kind of in the greater sense of the world, you know, what is my purpose here? A lot of us have insecurity. You know, we don't know who we are in relation to others. You know, a quote I heard, and it was so poignant, especially when I was going into high school when I heard this, but you wouldn't care so much what other people thought about you if you realized how little they actually did. You know, it's so true. You know, we think, you know, so much about what other people think, but most of us are concerned about ourselves anyways. And then a lack of a sense of self. You know, all of these, you know, either directly or indirectly can contribute to the stress in our life. So I put this quote, and this is actually one of our quotes here in the tunnels. Once you know, you can never not know, and you are forever changed. So once you know, and once you identify these triggers, it's up to you to make the change. You know it's a trigger, and now it's up to you to do something about it. So there's 3 things you could do. You could change the situation, you could change yourself to fit the situation better, or you could completely leave the situation. And so this is something, you know, again, meditate on, journal on, write down your ideas, write down your stressors, the triggers of stress in your life, and then readdress this. Okay, so totally shifting gears. Now we're going to kind of look at nutritionally, how do we support the adrenal glands? And before I go into this, you know, the way to think about this and the way to think about these herbs and the way to think about these supplements is if you were in a canoe and you got a hole in your canoe and water was coming in, taking these supplements is like giving you a bucket to flush the water out. But until you address that hole and until you address that water coming in your canoe, you're going to be expending a lot of energy and a lot of time just, you know, flushing that water out. So these supplements are a great, you know, adjunctive therapy, but a lot of it goes back to what we were just discussing in identifying the triggers of stress. And that's where you actually plug the hole in your canoe and you keep that stress from actually coming in your life. But there are a lot of really great supports. And I'm just going to mention a few a few herbals that support the adrenals. And I didn't give a lot of detail about these just because these really should be done under the care of a practitioner. You know, they can have an effect on, you know, other areas of the body. And so, so you want to use these kind of with caution. But herbal support specifically for the adrenal medulla, which we didn't talk about this one a whole lot, but the adrenal medulla is what releases our adrenaline, you know, which is that immediate stress response. It helps us adapt to that immediate stress. You know, a lot of these herbs are either an adaptogenic herb or they're a nervine herb. So they're going to either help the adrenals adapt to the stress or they're going to help calm down the systemic effect of, you know, some of these adrenal hormones. So, you know, so some of them I'll mention, you know, ginseng, you know, ashwagandha, skullcap, St. John's wort, oats. All of these are great supports for the adrenal medulla. Adrenal cortex. Now, the cortex is where we house a lot of the adrenal adrenal hormones that we just talked about. specifically your aldosterone, your cortisol, and your reproductive hormones. And these help you adapt to long-term stress. So two of them in particular that are excellent for this are licorice and wild yam. But I put a big asterisk by the Glycyrrhiza glabra, the licorice, because this one you definitely want to do under the care of a practitioner, because if you have any sort of, history of irregularity with your blood pressure, this can affect that because it's working on that entire adrenal cortex. So not only does it affect cortisol, but it also affects your aldosterone. And aldosterone affects fluid volume, which in turn affects your blood pressure. So again, these you definitely want to use under the care of a physician. Okay, nutritional support. This is where if anybody is a patient and you've gotten an IV vitamin C, when you're under stress, an IV vitamin C is absolutely one of the best things you can do because our IVs have most of these in them. And if not, we can actually add most of these to it. But vitamin C, we're the vitamin C capital of the world here at the Riordan Clinic. And you want to know the biggest users of vitamin C in the body? It's your adrenal gland. So your adrenal gland, when you're under stress, burns through a lot of vitamin C. So when you're under stress, increase your vitamin C level, whether it's orally or intravenously. You want to make sure that those levels stay high. Vitamin E. Vitamin E is a real potent antioxidant. And when your adrenal glands are needing to produce a lot of energy, there's a lot of kind of toxic byproducts that are produced called free radicals. And vitamin E will help calm down those free radicals. Pantothenic acid, this is one of my favorites. This is a B vitamin that's needed for, energy production. And it's also present in really high quantities in the adrenal gland. So whenever somebody's under, chronic stress or adrenal fatigue, their B5 levels are almost always in the tank. Niacin, is another B vitamin that's needed, again in the adrenal cascade for the enzyme support. Magnesium. Magnesium is also one of my favorites. And your body, since so much energy production is needed for the adrenal glands, the body will burn through a lot of magnesium when it's under stress. So magnesium is critical as far as energy production in the adrenals. Vitamin B6. And this is also, again, another B vitamin that's needed for enzyme support in the adrenal cascade. If you get the B6, I put it in parentheses, but make sure it's in the P5P form. And then trace minerals, your zinc, copper, chromium, manganese, and selenium. All of these also are needed for enzyme support. Okay, so what are some recommendations, things to take home we can do today? So this is Dr. Ann's stress adapting formula, and I actually, if anybody sees me walking around, I always have one of these because, let's face it, we're all under stress all the time. But so if you're ever wondering what's in the glass jar, it's magnesium. So I put 2 teaspoons of magnesium and then 1 teaspoon, which is the equivalent of 4,000 milligrams of vitamin C. And I'll do anywhere from 1 to 2 of these a day. And I'll put it in this jar, which I know is 32 ounces, and I'll sip on it throughout the day. And sometimes I'll actually do 2 of these. So you'll get better absorption if you do it over a slower period of time rather than all at once. Plus the magnesium can have an effect on your bowels, so you'll want to take that easy as well. And then also, taking a B6 complex. We have a supplement upstairs it's a nice blend of B vitamins, but higher in the B6, which is, again, important for adrenal fatigue. And then add 2 capsules of pantothenic acid. So 500 milligrams each, so it'd be a total of 1,000 milligrams. Split that up throughout the day, and that's a great start to help manage stress, and at least the effects of stress on the adrenal glands. Herbal teas, if you give up your coffee, you want to replace it with something. So all of these teas are either going to directly or indirectly have an effect on the adrenal glands. All of these teas also help with digestion. So, which again, since we talked about food being a big source of adrenal stress, these teas are great for both of those. And again, avoid all caffeinated beverages. It does have a bit of caffeine in it. So, yep, it does. So you'll want to watch that. We're running out of time here, so a few lifestyle changes: meditate, pray. One thing I'll point out here: taking a bath with Epsom salt, will help with calming tense muscles, help calm you down, and adding some essential oils to it also will help bring down that stress response. Exercise, even though exercise does increase cortisol levels a bit, over time it will help you manage your stress. And then dietary changes. I don't think we have time to go through these, but these are on there, and if you want more information about this, then come to the food course. This is the book. This is a book I recommend. I actually reference it a lot, in this lecture, and so if you want more information, this is an excellent book, an excellent reference to read on adrenal fatigue. All right, exactly 1 hour. Well, thank you guys so much.